Have you ever looked at someone you loved deeply, and realized you barely knew what was going on inside their heart? That was Rachel's story. Rachael grew up in a home where her father was present, yet distant. He was always there physically, driving her to school, fixing things around the house, making sure there was food on the table, but emotionally, he lived behind a wall. She remembers nights when her mother would try to talk to him, asking about his day. His answer was always the same. Fine. Nothing more. Nothing less. But Rachael could see it. She could see the heaviness in his eyes, the weariness in his silence, the way his shoulders slumped just a little lower each year. And as she grew older, she began to wonder, why? Why did her father rarely open up? Why was it easier for him to carry the world on his back than to share what was going on in his heart? This question stayed with her long after she left home. When she became an adult, Rachael started to look back at her father's life with new eyes. She wanted answers. She wanted to understand the man behind the silence. Because deep down, Rachael believed something powerful, that her father's silence wasn't just about him. It was a story of men everywhere. A story of fathers who loved their families deeply, but struggled to put that love into words. Pause, slow, reflective tone. And so, today, we step into Rachel's memory. Into her father's world. To uncover the reasons why fathers rarely open up, and the cost of that silence on the people who love them most. Rachael was only 7 years old when she first noticed the silence. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of silence that fills a room without asking for permission. Her father, Mr. Adeyemi, would sit at the dining table long after everyone had finished eating. His plate empty, his cup half drunk, but his eyes, lost. He would stare at nothing in particular, almost as if his mind had traveled somewhere far away. Rachael, full of energy and questions like any child her age, would run up to him with her drawings. "Daddy, look what I made," she would say, holding up a messy picture of a house with stick figures. Her father would smile, that gentle, tired smile, and say, "It's beautiful, Rachael." But then, nothing more. No excitement. No long conversation. Just that same smile, and silence. Her mother, Benita, would sometimes try to break through. "How was work today?" she'd ask, while clearing the table. And the reply was always short, almost rehearsed. Work was fine. It was as if he had built walls around himself, walls so high that neither his wife nor his daughter could climb over them. But here's what Rachael didn't know as a child. Behind those walls, her father was carrying battles he never spoke of. Financial struggles, pressures from work, the fear of failing as a provider, and the constant burden of being the family's rock. And in his mind, sharing those struggles felt like weakness. He believed if he opened up, if he let his wife or daughter see the cracks, the whole family would lose faith in him. So, he stayed silent. To Rachael, it looked like distance. To her mother, it felt like disconnection. But to him, it was sacrifice. He thought he was protecting them from his pain. Pause, emotional tone. Years later, Rachael would come to realize something powerful. Her father's silence wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he cared too much. Rachael was 12 the night it happened. It was a rainy evening. The kind where thunder shook the windows and the streets outside were drowning in water. The family had just finished dinner, and her father, as usual, sat at the table longer than everyone else. But that night was different. Rachael came back into the dining room for a glass of water when she saw him. Her father's shoulders were slumped, his face buried in his palms. She froze. She had never seen him like that before. He didn't know she was there. His chest rose and fell heavily, and for the first time in her life, she realized he wasn't just tired. He was breaking. Then she heard it, a whisper. Soft. Broken. Almost like a prayer. "God, how much longer can I carry this?" Rachel's little heart skipped. She had never heard those words from him. She wanted to run to him, to hug him, to ask what was wrong. But she didn't move. Something in her said he didn't want to be seen like this. So she just stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching the man she thought was unshakable finally crack. Moments later, her mother, Benita, walked in. She saw him too. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Talk to me," she whispered. But he shook his head. "I'm fine," he said quickly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. That same rehearsed line. That same silence. Benita's eyes watered, but she didn't push. She knew, she always knew, that her husband carried storms inside him that he refused to release. Rachel quietly tiptoed back to her room, her little hands trembling. That night, for the first time, she cried herself to sleep. Not because of her own pain, but because she had seen her father's. Pause, softer, reflective tone. And that's the tragedy of many fathers. The breaking point comes, but they cover it up. They patch the cracks with silence, hoping no one will notice. But the silence doesn't heal them. It only makes the weight heavier. Weeks passed after that rainy night. Rachel couldn't forget what she saw, her father breaking down at the table. It replayed in her mind every time she looked at him. But to everyone else, he was the same. The strong, dependable father. The man who carried groceries with one hand, who fixed broken chairs, who never raised his voice at home. To Rachel, though, he was different now. She knew there was something deeper. One Saturday afternoon, while her mother was in the kitchen, Rachel found him sitting in the living room. He was reading the newspaper, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. She sat quietly across from him, her heart racing. Then, with the innocence only a child could have, she asked, "Daddy, why don't you ever talk to us?" Her father looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" he asked, forcing a small smile. Rachel shifted in her seat. "Like, when you're sad. Or when something's wrong. You never say anything. You just say, 'I'm fine.' But I know you're not always fine." The room went silent. Her father's eyes softened. He set down the newspaper slowly, as though it had suddenly become too heavy. "Rachel," he began, but his voice cracked. It was the first time she had ever heard his voice break. He sighed deeply and leaned back in his chair. There are things, a father carries, that are too heavy to give to his children. Too heavy even to give to his wife sometimes. So we carry them alone. Rachel's little eyes filled with tears. "But isn't that lonely?" she whispered. He closed his eyes, pain etched across his face. "Yes," he admitted. "It's very lonely. But that's what it means to be a father. To carry the weight, even if no one ever knows." Rachel got up, walked to him, and wrapped her small arms around his chest. He froze at first, not used to being comforted. Then slowly, he hugged her back. That was the first hug Rachel ever remembered giving her father, not out of joy, but out of empathy. Pause, voice slows, deepens. And maybe that's the hidden story of fatherhood. They don't open up, not because they don't feel. Not because they don't hurt. But because they believe silence is their duty. They confuse strength with secrecy. They mistake vulnerability for weakness. And in that confusion, they lock away their emotions, building walls so high even their own families can't climb them. That night, after Rachel's question, her father couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of years pressing down on his chest. Memories he had buried long ago began to resurface. He remembered his own father. A man of few words. A man of stone. Growing up, he never once saw his father cry. When the farm failed, when debts piled up, when his mother wept quietly in the kitchen, his father only clenched his jaw, tightened his belt, and went back to work. The boy who would become Rachel's father grew up in a house where silence was strength, and tears were weakness. He learned early that men who spoke of their pain were seen as fragile. And fragile men didn't survive. So he built walls. Brick by brick. Every disappointment, every heartbreak, every fear, he locked it all away inside. When he was in school and failed an exam, he said nothing. When he was mocked for wearing old clothes, he said nothing. When his mother passed away, and he felt like his chest was breaking apart, he stood at the graveside and said nothing. It became second nature. Silence was his armor. And by the time he became a husband and father, the armor had grown so thick, even love couldn't easily break through. Tone shifts, narration becomes universal, addressing the audience directly. And this is not just his story. This is the story of countless fathers. Men raised in cultures, in families, in worlds where a father's worth is measured by how much he endures in silence. Where their pain is dismissed, their struggles invisible, their voices muted. Society applauds their strength, but forgets to ask about their wounds. So they keep smiling. Keep working. Keep carrying the weight. Until one day, the weight carries them. Return to Rachel's father, intimate tone. Lying in bed that night, he finally understood something. Rachael wasn't asking for him to be perfect. She wasn't asking him to have all the answers. She was only asking him to be human. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if he could allow himself to be. The months rolled by, and Rachael noticed small changes in her father. He was still the same man who woke early, worked late, and carried the family on his back, but his silence grew heavier. At dinner, he barely spoke. He would stare into his food as though lost in another world. When Rachael asked him about his day, he always replied with the same word, fine. It didn't matter if the day had been brutal, if the boss had berated him, if money had run short, fine was the shield he used. But shields, no matter how strong, begin to crack. One evening, Rachael overheard her parents arguing in hushed voices. Her mother's tone was filled with concern. Why don't you ever tell me what you're going through? I'm your wife. I can see you're hurting, but you just shut me out. Her father's voice trembled with frustration. Because what good will it do? If I tell you, will the bills disappear? Will the problems vanish? No, it's my job to carry it. Alone. Rachael froze in the hallway, listening. Her heart broke. She had never heard her father's voice so raw, so close to tears. She realized then that the silence wasn't strength, it was pain wrapped in pride. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Her father returned home late. His shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world was chained to his back. He entered the living room, sat on the couch, and buried his face in his hands. For the first time in Rachel's life, she saw him cry. Not loud, not dramatic, but a quiet, trembling cry. The kind that comes from years of unspoken words, hidden fears, and invisible battles. Rachael stood by the doorway, paralyzed. This was her hero. Her protector. The unshakable rock. And now, he looked like a broken man. Her mother walked in, gently placed a hand on his shoulder, and whispered. You don't always have to be strong. Not here. Not with us. But he shook his head, wiping his face quickly, ashamed of the tears. They can't see me like this, he whispered. I have to be strong, for them. Rachel's heart ached. For the first time, she understood why fathers rarely open up. It wasn't that they didn't feel. It wasn't that they didn't want to share. It was that they had been trained, from boyhood, to believe that vulnerability is weakness. And weakness has no place in a father's role. The silence, Rachael realized, was his way of protecting them. But it was also the very thing that was slowly destroying him. Rachael couldn't sleep that night. The image of her father. Head bowed, shoulders trembling, played again and again in her mind. For years, she had thought of him as indestructible, a man of stone. But what she had seen wasn't weakness. It was humanity. The next morning, she tiptoed into the kitchen where he sat with his cup of coffee. The newspaper was open in front of him, but she could tell he wasn't reading. His eyes were distant, heavy with thoughts he couldn't share. Rachael hesitated, her heart pounding. She had never confronted her father like this before. Finally, she slid into the chair beside him. For a while, silence filled the room, thick and almost unbearable. Then, with a small, shaky voice, she asked, "Rachael, Dad, why don't you ever tell us when you're hurting?" Her father looked up, startled. His first instinct was to deflect, to give the same old answer, "I'm fine." But the sincerity in her eyes, the gentleness in her voice, held him still. He sighed, placing the cup down carefully. "Father, I don't want you to see me as weak, Rachael. Fathers aren't supposed to break. We're supposed to be strong, unshakable, dependable." Rachael leaned closer, her voice soft but steady. "Rachael, but Dad, strength isn't never crying. Strength isn't pretending everything's okay. Strength is being real. Sharing what hurts. Letting us carry some of it with you." He blinked, stunned by her words. The wall he had built over decades felt like it was trembling. "Father, if I tell you everything I carry, the disappointments, the failures, the fears, what will you think of me? I don't want you to lose respect for me." Rachael shook her head quickly, her own eyes filling with tears. "Rachael, Dad, respect isn't about never failing. It's about never giving up. It's about showing us what courage really looks like, even when life is hard. I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to be, you." Her father swallowed hard. His hands, rough and scarred, trembled slightly on the table. For so long, he had believed silence was love, that by carrying everything alone, he was protecting them. But maybe, just maybe, love wasn't about isolation. Maybe love was letting the people you protect you too. Tears welled up in his eyes, and this time he didn't hide them. Instead, he reached across the table and held Rachael's hand. "Father, you have no idea how much I've needed to hear that," he whispered. Rachael squeezed his hand, her voice breaking. "Rachael, you don't have to do this alone anymore, Dad. Not with me. Not with Mom. We're here. We want to be here, for all of it." For the first time in years, he let out a deep, shuddering breath. The weight hadn't vanished. But it felt lighter now, because he no longer carried it in silence. It was the first crack in the wall he had built his entire life. A small opening, but enough to let the light in. That night, Rachael couldn't stop thinking about her father's words. She had always known him as the man who carried the family, the man who worked late, who fixed broken things, who always seemed to have the answers. But now, she had seen the cracks. And instead of fear, she felt something else, love. Deeper love. Still, she needed to understand. Why had he been so closed off for so long? Why did he believe silence was strength? So Rachael went to the living room, where her mother sat knitting quietly, the soft click of the needles filling the space. She hesitated, then sat down beside her. "Rachael, Mom, can I ask you something?" Her mother looked up, surprised. "Of course, sweetheart." Rachael's voice trembled. "Rachael, why doesn't Dad ever open up? Why does he always keep everything bottled inside?" Her mother sighed deeply, setting the knitting aside. There was a heaviness in her eyes, a story untold for too long. "Mother, your father, he grew up in a world that didn't allow men to cry. Didn't allow men to show weakness. From the time he was a boy, he was told to be strong, don't cry, man up. Those words built walls around his heart. He believed that if he let anyone see his pain, he would lose respect, lose value." Rachael listened, her heart aching. Rachael, but that's not fair. Nobody can carry everything alone. Her mother nodded. Mother, you're right. But when you've been taught something your entire life, it's hard to unlearn. Your father has carried not just the weight of this family, but also the weight of his past. The expectations, the disappointments, the sacrifices nobody talks about. She paused, her eyes softening. Mother, I see him, Rachael. Even when he doesn't say a word, I see the pain in his eyes. I know the nights he stays awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every failure he thinks he's made. He believes his silence protects us. But sometimes, I wish he would let us in. Because love isn't about shielding, it's about sharing. Rachel's eyes brimmed with tears. She thought of the nights her father came home late, too tired to talk. The mornings he left before sunrise, chasing after a paycheck to keep food on the table. The way he smiled even when his eyes looked sad. Rachael, Mom, do you ever get angry at him? For not letting you in? Her mother smiled sadly. Mother, sometimes. But then I remind myself, he's not withholding because he doesn't trust me. He's withholding because he doesn't trust himself to be seen as fragile. And fragility, to him, feels like failure. Silence lingered between them. Rachael finally whispered. Rachael, I wish he knew we don't see him as weak. We see him as strong because he loves us so much. Even in silence. Her mother reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Rachel's face. Mother, you told him that today, didn't you? Rachael nodded. Mother, good. Keep telling him. Because sometimes, it takes years to undo the lies we were taught. But love can break through even the hardest walls. Rachael leaned into her mother's embrace. In that moment, she realized something profound. Her father wasn't just silent because of pride. He was silent because he had been taught that silence was survival. And now, it was her turn to help him unlearn. Rachael sat in her room, the glow of her study lamp spreading a soft circle of light across her journal. The house was quiet, her mother was asleep, and her father had long since gone to bed after another exhausting day. But Rachael couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed the scene at the dinner table. Her father laughing at her brother's silly jokes, his voice steady, his posture proud. On the surface, he looked like every strong father figure society expected him to be. But Rachael remembered the way his eyes had shifted when no one was looking. That flicker of pain. That shadow of fatigue. She picked up her pen and wrote. Why don't fathers open up? Why does Dad always hide his struggles? Her thoughts spiraled into memories. She remembered being 10 years old, watching her father leave for work in the pouring rain, holding a tattered umbrella that barely shielded him. He came home soaked, but smiling, carrying bread in his hands because he didn't want his children to go to bed hungry. She remembered the nights she overheard whispers between her parents in the kitchen, her mother's voice soft, worried about bills, and her father's reply firm, calm, as if nothing could shake him. But she could hear the weight in his tone, the exhaustion in his sighs. And then she remembered the time she asked him, Dad, are you okay? He smiled and replied, I'm fine, princess. Don't worry about me. But she could see it, the fine lines on his forehead, the heavy shoulders, the tired eyes. Rachael tapped the pen against her journal. She realized it wasn't that her father didn't trust them or didn't want to share. It was something deeper. Her mind wandered. Maybe fathers rarely open up because they've been told their whole lives that vulnerability is weakness. Maybe they fear that if they show their struggles, their families will lose faith in them. Maybe they think silence is the best way to protect the people they love. Rachael whispered into the quiet room. But silence is heavy. Silence builds walls. And one day, silence breaks. Tears welled up in her eyes. She thought of the sacrifices he made, the dreams he buried, the nights he stayed awake worrying, the battles he fought silently. And she asked herself, Who carries him, when he's always the one carrying us? In that moment, Rachael made a decision. She wasn't going to let her father drown in silence. She would find a way to reach him. Maybe not through big confrontations, but through little gestures. Sitting with him more often. Asking him about his day, even if he brushed it off. Sharing her own struggles, hoping he'd feel safe to share his. Because she realized something powerful, sometimes fathers don't open up because no one gives them permission to. They don't feel invited into the space of vulnerability. Rachael closed her journal and whispered to herself. I will be that invitation for him. The lamp flickered slightly, and she smiled through her tears. One day, he'll tell me his story. And when he does, I'll be ready to listen. The morning sun rose quietly, spilling golden light into the family's small living room. Rachael sat at the table, sipping tea, her eyes fixed on her father as he tied his shoes, preparing for yet another long day at work. He looked just like he always did, steady, composed, almost unshakable. To anyone else, he was just a father doing his duty. But to Rachael, after last night's reflections, he looked different. She saw beyond the surface. She saw the hidden cracks, the weight behind his calm face, the silent sacrifices nobody ever noticed. And for the first time, she whispered softly, "Thank you, Dad." He looked up, surprised. "For what?" he asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. "For everything," Rachael replied. Her father chuckled lightly, shaking his head as though her gratitude was unnecessary. But in his eyes, just for a brief second, Rachael saw something she had never seen before. A shimmer of relief. A crack in the wall. A tiny glimpse of a man who longed to be seen not just as a provider, but as a person. The universal reflection. The truth is, Rachael's father isn't alone. His story is the story of millions of fathers around the world. Men who rise before the sun, who fight battles we never see, who swallow their pain because they believe strength is silence. But here's the reality, silence doesn't mean absence. Silence doesn't mean a lack of love. Silence doesn't mean indifference. It often means they are carrying more than words can express. Think about it, how many fathers have stood in the background of family pictures, unnoticed, while their children smile at the camera? How many fathers have skipped meals to make sure their children eat? How many have cried quietly in the bathroom, wiped their tears, and walked out with a brave face because they thought their family needed a hero, not a human? We live in a world that often praises the visible sacrifices, the gifts, the gestures, the grand displays of love. But the sacrifices of fathers are often invisible. They exist in the overtime hours, in the loans they take silently, in the health they ignore, in the dreams they postpone. Why fathers rarely open up? Fathers rarely open up because society has told them that vulnerability is weakness. They were raised with phrases like, "Be a man. Don't cry. Real men don't complain." And so they build walls. Walls so tall that even the people closest to them, their wives, their children, often can't climb over. But behind those walls are stories untold, emotions unshared, and pain unspoken. And yet, fathers carry on. Not because they don't feel, but because they feel so deeply that they'd rather suffer quietly than burden the ones they love. A call to see fathers differently. Rachael realized something powerful, something we must all realize. Fathers don't need to be perfect. They don't need to be unshakable. They don't need to hide. They need to be seen. They need to be heard. They need to know it's okay to say, "I'm tired. I'm scared. I need help." Imagine what could change if children asked their fathers more often, "How are you really?" Imagine if wives reminded their husbands, "You don't always have to be strong for us. We're strong enough to hold you too." Imagine if society stopped shaming men for being human, and instead applauded them for their honesty. Maybe then, fathers would open up more. Maybe then, silence wouldn't be their only language. The final thought. As Rachael closed her journal that night, she realized something simple yet profound. Fathers are not superheroes. They are men, human, fragile, flawed, yet full of love. And maybe the greatest gift we can give them is not more expectations, but more compassion. Not more silence, but more space. Not more pressure, but more presence. So tonight, if you still have a father in your life, pause for a moment. Look at him closely. Notice the lines on his face, the way his hands have aged, the quiet sacrifices etched into his body. And whisper the words he rarely hears. I see you. I appreciate you. And you don't always have to be strong for me. Because sometimes, the greatest act of love is not in what fathers give us, but in what we give back to them, the permission to finally be human. If you've connected with this story, remember, fathers everywhere are carrying silent battles. Let's start listening. Let's start asking. And if this message touched your heart, kindly subscribe, so we can continue sharing stories that matter.